Good evening. How are you?
Very well.
Great, thank you. Let me welcome you to yet another event in the Krasno event series. I'm Klaus Lauris. I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It's very nice to see you, and I would like to welcome in particular our Dean, the Dean of Arts and Social Sciences, Professor Kevin Guskiewicz. The Dean has been in office since January 2016, and since then he has become a very strong supporter of the Krasno event series, and that is of course very much appreciated. Today it's the last one of our Krasno event series for this semester, but there's more to come next semester, of course. As you may know, I started the Krasno event series in the fall of 2012. And since then, we have gained you as loyal followers. Many of you are coming back almost for every event, and that is greatly appreciated, of course. I would also like to thank our sponsors. That is the College of Arts and Sciences, it is the History Department, it is PWAD, it is TIS, and many others. And I would also like in particular to a number of small donations we have got from private sponsors, so that has been greatly appreciated. Our funding is not that great, so every support is very welcome indeed. During the summer, don't forget, when we are not having events, during the summer, don't forget to check out our YouTube channel. As you know, we are taping all our events, so you can look at all these exciting events throughout the summer, and I hope you will do so. It is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. Today, we have an event on the United States and China. We are talking about trade rivalries, and we are talking about a geopolitical conflict between great powers. We have two special guests. That is Audrey Winter of the Trade Representative's Office in Washington, D.C., and Maximilian MAYER, Professor Maximilian MAYER of Tongji University in Shanghai. Maximilian MAYER is not Chinese, he is German, but he speaks excellent Mandarin, which makes up for that, I think. He's an expert on Chinese politics, on Chinese culture, and today he will talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, China's new Silk Road. And he will also talk about the geopolitical implications of that grand infrastructure which the Chinese inaugurated in 2013. Max and I met at Tongji University a little while ago when I gave a few lectures there, and I'm very grateful that today he could make it to visit Chapel Hill. Audrey Winter is Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for China Affairs, a very long title, at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative in Washington, D.C. Audrey handles China trade policy, including such easy topics such as intellectual property rights, investment, competition, government procurement, and the rule of law and transparency matters. She is also responsible for U.S. trade relations on China with Europe and the European Union. Audrey Winter is a trained lawyer who has negotiated international trade treaties for the U.S. government, has litigated WTO dispute settlement cases for the United States, and has worked at major law firms in Washington, D.C. and also in Brussels. And she also worked for the U.S. Department of Commerce and, I understand, for the EU Commission in Brussels. Audrey and I met at a conference on China in Washington, D.C. a little while ago, and I'm very grateful to her that among her busy things and in her busy schedule, she could find the time to come and visit us today. In the following, Audrey Winter will talk to us about US economic and trade policy towards China and what actually is going on at the moment. What is the Trump administration doing? What is Xi Jinping in China doing? And she will enlighten us, I hope. And then Max MAYER will talk about the Belt and Road Initiative and its geopolitical and cultural implications. Then I will briefly interrogate them afterwards, just a little bit. And after that, we will open it to questions from you, the audience. So I think we will have a very exciting and stimulating evening. And ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Audrey Winter and Maximilian MAYER to Chapel Hill. Let's start with Audrey Winter tonight.
I guess I should stop there because I think I've talked too long. And I look forward to hearing a lot of your questions.
MAYER is next.
Look. Can I set this? Yeah, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay. First of all, I want to thank the Krasner Event Series for this invitation to be here today and have this really big crowd, and I think a lot of interested and quite knowledgeable people. So I'm looking forward to a quite interesting and maybe also controversial discussion. I also want to thank Klaus personally for inviting me here and having a dialogue between maybe a more Chinese perspective. As you said already, you put me in a box. I'm not speaking for China here in any way, but I live and work in China for a couple of years, and once you stay longer in another country, you also learn a lot about different perspectives, right? And I also think about Europe and Germany quite differently after this long time in China. So in a way, I try to provide a complementary perspective, and also focusing a little bit more on not only the economics but also the cultural aspect of the Belt and Road. And in many ways, the Belt and Road is also an answer to the same problem Audrey was talking about, just with a different goal. So what is the background of this big initiative of the Chinese government, the so-called Belt and Road Initiative? It was officially declared in 2013 by President Xi Jinping. He was just half a year in office and made this his signature project. And this comes along with a growing ambition of Chinese political elites and economic elites that China can take a bigger role in the world, and indeed there's also an expectation from many countries that China should take a bigger role. After all, it has a growing share of global trade and the global economy. One aspect of that is that a particular form of Chinese foreign policy could be called the infrastructural foreign policy. So investment in big infrastructure projects became more a very high-level initiative. Before that it happened anyway, but there was no sort of coordinated strategy behind that. But that became more coordinated strategy with the Belt and Road project. That's one aspect of that. The other aspect is a growing financialization of foreign aid. So what China does abroad is becoming more through financial tools, and that's a growing trend, which is also an element of that. I think unexpectedly for the Chinese government, the feedback was quite positive. So there were many countries and governments buying into that initiative, and there was quite strong uptake. So it was a growing diplomatic momentum. Now it's more than 60 countries, 5 regions of the world involved. And it's also, from a historical point of view, combining existing policies. So the Belt and Road is not something completely new out there. It's, in a way, a combination of policies which were already existing. I will talk about this a little bit more later, especially energy policy and the trade routes and the collaboration with countries in the Central Asian region was there before. So it has been repackaged in a way and put in a more global framing. As part of the Belt and Road Initiative, China has also started to establish new institutions, especially the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. It's the most significant case, but there are other funding initiatives, and the Belt and Road Summit, first time last year, organized in Beijing. So that's the background. Geographically, that's one of the official maps put out by the Chinese government, and you see there are basically 2 elements. One is the land-based element, and one is the sea-based element, the maritime road and the belt. Meanwhile, we have a third element actually since half a year. There's also now an official policy through the polar region, through the Arctic region, so there's now also a polar Silk Road. So it has 3 legs, one land-based leg and 2 maritime legs. There was a lot of confusion also about Silk Road. So there was not only like a diplomatic momentum, but also a lot of people, and actually until today, are confused. What is that about, this Silk Road or this initiative? One reason is that the name of it, the official translation of the Chinese name, has changed over times, and it used to be a strategy, then it was a policy, now it's an initiative. And the reason for that is certainly that this name, the Chinese version is Idailu, is more or less a party slogan, as the Communist Party uses it in various domestic fields. But this kind of party slogans are not working well as a PR concept in a broader international audience. So people simply didn't understand what this means. Another problem is also that until now it's totally unclear where is the limit of that initiative, right? Which country can actually participate, which country cannot. So the geographical scope has been extended all the time. Not only Central Asian countries said we want to participate, suddenly also Eastern African countries, South Africa said we want to participate. Now even some Latin American countries are part of that so-called Silk Road. I mean, that's nothing to do with the old Silk Road, of course, right? It's far out there. It's quite a different connection. But this also creates a lot of confusion. Another reason, and that's, I think, also connected to what Audrey said, the Chinese political system is, of course, quite different from democratic systems, and the normative discourse in China is also quite different. So lots of concepts which seem quite normal for Chinese politicians or for the policymaker community doesn't make any sense for the rest of the world. So selling this concept is very difficult because nobody understands it. For example, what's the meaning exactly of a community of destiny in Asia? That's one of the key normative statements the Chinese president makes all the time. Very few people understand what this means exactly. Or the same thing, what exactly is inclusivity? Right? How can you operationalize the idea of inclusiveness? Another issue with the Belt and Road is the question of how can this be translated into sustainable institutions. Right? We have a summit, we have a couple of funding institutions, but what is the institutional structure in a broader sense which can carry on that initiative? That's completely unclear. There's a huge debate among Chinese experts how to do that. I'm also writing and supporting advice for Chinese government how they could carry forward, what's the different options. But at the moment there's no clear understanding what's the way forward of making this more institutionalized. And last but not least, it's also an issue, the Belt and Road became so successful and so many people talking about it, so many conferences, it seems like the entire Chinese foreign policy is suddenly Belt and Road. And that's of course confusing, because what is that about then, right? Immediately the idea is this is about global hegemony, which I think it's definitely not, but the sort of impression is very quickly there. There are a couple of motivations and goals we can say now. They were there. I think 5 years ago or 4 years ago was more complicated, but now we know a little bit more what's behind that actually. One argument is always, yeah, it's about geopolitics and grand strategy. I don't think there is enough evidence for that, especially the Belt and Road until now has no military component. Whatever you read in the media, and I know that's a lot out there, there is no military component. Indeed, for example, Pakistan is such a case. The Pakistani government has asked China a couple of times in the last 6 years, please take a naval port, please build up a military station or military somehow facilities. China said, no, we're not doing that. Exactly for that reason, because we don't want the Belt and Road to turn into a geopolitical game. So there's not enough evidence to say this is really geopolitics. Of course, it's also about soft power and maybe hedging against the Asian pivot of the Obama administration, but also against Russia to some degree. Even though there's a very close cooperation with Russia, there is also disagreement with Russia. So the Belt and Road is also in a way to buy in Russia in something Russia probably would otherwise not do. But more important than this grand strategy narrative in terms of reasons is actually a nexus between domestic and foreign policy. So the Silk Road functions in a way to combine things China needs to accomplish internally, especially economic policy, and externally. And that sort of combination is one of the key drivers. For example, quite explicitly, the internationalization of the Chinese currency. Not much has happened, but there's a couple of options built into the Belt and Road Initiative how this could work. For example, trade between some of these countries and China will be, or are already partly denominated, no longer in dollar, but in yuan. Right? And that's the way how you make your currency work outside your own borders. More important than that, and that comes directly to what Audrey said, is the problem of overaccumulation. Right? A lot of industries in China have this problem. Not only steel, but also construction industry, even finance industry, because there's just too much money in China. They don't know where to invest it. You have to channel it somewhere else. There's already a housing bubble in China, so you can't put that inside the country. You need to shift it outwards. And also, for example, the construction industry, the big construction boom is over more or less, and there are a lot of people working in that industry. So what are you going to do? You need to subsidize that industry if you don't want to have a lot of unemployment. So you send these companies outside somewhere else to undertake construction work, and that's sort of the underlying domestic rationale to which is driving the Belt and Road. And last but not least, and this comes a little bit back to the grand strategy question, of course there is also a debate in China, quite lively, should the country take up a real grand strategy? Should China challenge the United States? Should China drive at least, or try to achieve a regional hegemony to some degree, right? A region which excludes the United States and has Japan and China defining the border in East Asia. There is a discussion about Chinese experts about this issue, but there are quite different opinions about that. It's not that there's a clear direction where to go. Indeed, most Chinese strategic experts, when you talk to them privately, are very reserved and very cautious concerning the Belt and Road because they think there will be an overstretch for China. So what I'm not going to talk is the political struggles and the geopolitical aspect, because that's the aspect you have certainly been reading in the media too much. I think that's totally overemphasized. Therefore, I want to talk about two other aspects. One is geoeconomic shifts, and the other one, which is not talked about at all, but I think it's quite significant, is the geocultural formations which are linked to the Belt and Road, and which have also strategic implications, but which are much broader, about a cultural shift in how world order is constructed. So the key to geoeconomic interpretations of the Belt and Road are: one, capitalist expansion driven by state-owned enterprises. Right? So that's exactly the kind of argument that behind that is not market forces, behind that is mainly state-owned enterprises who are conducting those investments, who are building those infrastructures, and who also maybe try to control the economies of that countries. The other argument out there as well, this is actually not only about capitalist expansion, it's also about redrawing the structure of the economic world order, and in some way a post-liberal world order. The funny thing is that if you look in the policy documents, it's very clearly stated that this is actually following market operations, right? And the market should be, market ideas should be the underlying principles driving that Belt and Road. Well, but let's go back a step. This is a presentation of the world economy during the last 2,000 years. I think that's the best data we have. I think this data, there's a lot of problems in that data, so I'm happy to discuss this. But nevertheless, in the last 100, 200 years, it's pretty precise. Before that, I wouldn't believe all of this, but in this period, it's pretty precise. And it shows basically that the economies of Asia, especially China, India, Japan, and Russia, are now back to roughly 50% of the, and even more now. I mean, the data ends in 2008, so this trend is going on. Having more than 50% of the global GDP. So naturally, there is a gravitational shift towards the Pacific, and that's well recognized by economists, and that's also, of course, reflected already in the shift of strategy by the Obama administration. The Asian pivot is especially an economic policy, not so much a strategic military policy. You see also this from trade data, for example, that roughly now we have a a trilateral global trade system. We have the European Union, US, and China roughly having the same share in global trade. So China has naturally a much more important position than when it entered the WTO, and even more so when it started the reform and opening policies in the 70s. And therefore you can assume it's just natural that China has a much broader interest in everything which is going on economically, regarding trade, regarding investment, regarding jurisdictions all over the world, regarding resources and so forth. So in some sense, it's just the growing, I mean, there's a reflection, right, of the growing national interest China has. And that's something nobody can, in a way, deny, right? That's very legitimate national interest there. Every nation would be concerned about what's going on if you are in that position. And what the Belt and Road did was focusing very strongly on those infrastructure hard projects, which building roads, which are building ports, which are building train connections. This is here the big train connection to Kazakhstan. This is the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Basically, if we read from the plans, turning the whole country, Pakistan, into one corridor. And so forth. So there's a strong focus on the technologies of the 19th century in some way, right? But because that's all technologies. I mean, the West had this already in the 19th century. But there's also a digital component. So China is also exporting increasingly not only fast internet, but also surveillance tools and smart city technologies and so forth. Because Chinese cities in many aspects are much more modern than most American cities. And that's becoming a quite important export technology. I have been talking about financial institutions. I'm not going here into detail, but there's a couple of different new institutions which are China-led and putting quite a huge amount of money on the table for exactly that projects. Why have been, I mean, from these numbers you can read something. This is investment direly needed in most of these countries. And China is the only player who puts that money on the table. So many governments are really happy that this money is there. They couldn't get it from the World Bank, they couldn't get it from the Asian Development Bank, and also not from other investors. For many reasons, China might end up with a lot of debts this country cannot repay. Right? But that's another story. So for the moment, many countries are happy that there's an actor out there who provides that kind of money. That's the Belt and Road Summit in Beijing. Just an impression. Okay, energy policy. One underlying, and that's a more strategic element, but of course related to energy security, energy supply security, is China's problem being a massive, having to import massively gas and oil. And this has started actually in the 90s. There was a massive surprise. Suddenly, within 2 years, China became netto importer, and ever since, the government has tried to cope with that. And there were a lot of different policies after the mid-90s. One of those policies were to, while China becoming ever more dependent, and this is a trend which goes on, so we'll, maybe in 20 years we'll have to import 70% or even maybe 75% of all energy needs. They started a huge diversification of the import sources. And many of these countries, which became energy supporters, delivering oil and gas to China, are also part of the Belt and Road today. They are in the same geography, especially Central Asia and Russia. Back then, China has been talking about the so-called Malacca dilemma. Some of you might know that, the idea that the Malacca Strait, through which all the trade and the energy is going, could be blocked in a case of war or in a case of conflict, and China would be no longer sustainable as an economy. So how can you go around that Malacca dilemma? The Belt and Road is one answer to that. And there were many sort of routes proposed back then. These routes are now put into reality. Back then, nobody has been talking about Silk Road or anything like that. That was just energy politics. Another element economically, I think, which is underestimated is the territorial rescaling which is going on through those Chinese investments. And that has two elements. One element is that, and I'm coming back to that later, using some maps to show you what this means actually, that Eurasia is envisioned as one economic entity, borderless, which is part sort of the new Chinese economic sphere. And that's a quite big, in terms of ideas, rescaling of space. On the smaller scale, you see, like in the case of Pakistan, that countries or regions are turned into corridors. That's an economic strategy China has used internally. Right? There are a lot of planned corridors within China, so it's a development strategy which is now applied abroad. And a third component is the South-South collaboration, especially China-Africa collaboration, which now plays in that narrative very handily. And here we see also that this economic element of the Belt and Road is important as a way to export Chinese practices, experiences, and increasingly norms, how you develop a country. This is a study done by friends of mine for the United Nations, and they were comparing different African countries in which the Chinese government or Chinese government-owned enterprises have set up special economic zones and infrastructure corridors for driving their economies and for developing these countries. Some of them have worked well, others are total failure. So it's a mixed picture, but it's definitely a new model. This has actually already sort of informed World Bank, and there's now a sort of a refocusing of World Bank investment in terms of hard infrastructure. So the World Bank came back to the idea, maybe it's not so bad if we also build a road on the sidelines. But it's sort of a convergence of Chinese ideas of development and what the World Bank is doing. There's not much conflict out there actually in this term. That's more complementary development. However, how important can the Belt and Road countries actually be for the Chinese economy? I would argue not that important. And you see that with me talking today, the trade war. Why is that? Because China is still so much important on the trade with Europe and the United States. And that can never be replaced by these relatively small and underdeveloped economies. For example, you see here, like there's a long-term trend that the export dependency is going down, but this trend has been reversed and it's still going up. So we still, with 40% Chinese exports and growing, which are dependent on the European and the American markets. And even more important, if you, that will be the yellow line, if you are deducting the trade with the European Union and the United States, China would have a trade deficit with the world and would have to finance that trade deficit with the world. And that's not going to be revised by any trade with the Belt and Road countries. That's not going to happen. So in that sense, and that's also what many economists are saying in China, that there is no economic, actually really well thought reason why you would do that kind of investments, aside from the deleveraging, economic deleveraging of too much money in China. From the trade part, doesn't make sense. Okay, I want to move on from that and talk a little bit about the geocultural elements of the Belt and Road, and that's something which is mostly overseen. That's a citation from the official policy paper from 2015, and I just want to have you read that, because I think the most Chinese policy papers are often seen as pure, not worth the paper they are wrote on, but I think there's a deeper meaning behind that one, and we can see that actually playing out in reality. The idea that underlying this Belt and Road is also an approach which advocates tolerance between civilizations and which is in essence a culturally relativist stance. So it's not a universalist stance like Western countries would normally pursue. It's a cultural relativist stance which accepts totally different legal systems, totally different value systems, and so forth. At least in theory. How this works out in practice is a different question. But we are talking here about sort of the principle level. Where can we find that? Let's start with the geographical imagination in the Silk Road. Since the Chinese president has proposed this initiative, there have been dozens of maps mapping what's actually going on here. And that's Chinese maps, that's maps from journalists, from newspapers, from think tanks, and so forth. So all over the world. The interesting thing, I've done a collection of these maps, like over 60 maps. They all look the same. They all look the same. And that's really fascinating, right? because there was no coordination between most of those people making those maps. And what are those maps telling us? First of all, the world is Eurasia. There is no Atlantic world, there is no Americas. That's simply not existing, right? That's not on a map. The world is somehow, China is not in the middle. China is sort of on the right side. In the middle is Indian and the Indian Ocean and part of Central Asia. Another interesting thing for all of you who are sort of in international relations, the country borders are either not there or de-emphasized. It's also interesting. So the sovereignty of countries is in those maps, at least, somehow less important. And we know this, of course, from colonial maps, right? That's how African maps look like in the 19th century. It's just blank space, you can do whatever you want, somehow, right? It has a certain colonial ring in that. And you have instead corridors, right? Large-scale things, like really big scaling. And since we all share these maps now, there is indeed a change of geographical imagination related to the Belt and Road. So in that sense, the Belt and Road was quite successful in shifting the way how we picture the world. I'm not saying this is dominant, but this kind of maps are around quite a lot. Related to that map is an attempt from the Chinese side not only to remap the world, but also to re-narrate the world history. What is the world history about? Is the world history really about the end of history? Is it really the Western systems winning out? Or is the world's history rather the glory of the ancient Silk Roads, which China is now claiming for itself, replacing what is called in China the century of humiliation, right? The idea that China has been totally destroyed, or at least lost its sovereignty almost completely against the Western colonial powers, and that has been quite a strong trope in Chinese education and in the public emotions. Lots of that is also constructed, of course, by the education system, so that's not naturally grown only. Right? But it's also a reflection of the historical happenings. And this standard story is replaced by a much more glorious story about Chinese past. And by that, you have a totally different world history. So you no longer are the country which has lost, but which is on the long arch of history going back to its central positions. You can find this, I mean, this is not just a very big kind of story. It's also more fine-grained that just read any Chinese stories or any Chinese official narration or experts. They typically start with archaeological findings. And by that they say, we are not just making here something up, we're not talking fantasy, we are talking historical reality. And this is a way using history, or making use of history, which is very powerful and has been overtaken by others as well. So what is constructed here is in a way a narrative which is about hyper-connectivity. You build all these roads, you build new highways, shipping, logistics, in a post-Atlantic and maybe an Eastphalian world, right? which follows totally different rules. How long did I say that?
Not wrong.
Okay. Okay, part of that story is, and I'm of course simplifying here, it's much more complex than that, but I try to sort of tease out the core of that, is that China is indeed, since 150 years, searching for its own identity in reaction towards modernization, in reaction towards the political and the actual physical violence done by the other great powers. Right? Don't forget that the Europeans and the rest, we have invaded Beijing, we have destroyed a lot of stuff there, we have semi-colonized them. So, and this gave rise to a very strong intellectual reaction. How can we deal with that? How do we have to modernize us? So this discussion that Chinese elites have today is actually always referring back to what they have been discussing already in the 19th century, end of 19th century. That's not a new discussion at all. And that's really important to understand this internal discursive trajectory. Deng Xiaoping in the late 70s made a very fundamental decision to go back into the Western world system, to go back in the capitalist system. Right? That was a fundamental change of course after Mao. And actually Mao started that. I mean, Mao made actually the decision to do that, right? Because the political reconciliation was already there, and the idea was there also economically to do something, but the guy who really put that in place and pursued that for all his life was Deng Xiaoping. So I think it was very important with this discussion. Maybe now we are in a historical moment where the sort of the pendulum is going back. Perhaps, I'm not so sure about that. But that's something we are seeing. And what we're also seeing is, given Chinese economic success, that there is a massively growing ambition and I would say over self-confidence what China can do. I mean, my personal assessment is that most Chinese strategic, or many Chinese strategic experts are over-assessing the capacities China has, politically, militarily, economically. But that's reality in Beijing at the moment. What is also happening is that within the Chinese foreign policy community and development experts and economists, they started thinking seriously about how to develop the rest of the world following Chinese experiences. Not necessarily following Chinese model. There is no Chinese model. That doesn't exist. That's nonsense. It has changed so often, and the reality in China is so shape-shifting, there is no model. I would strongly disagree with that notion. But there is a discussion, for example, how to think about the world from a genuinely Chinese point of view, and that's part of this story of identity building. Right? What's Chinese role in the world? How should from Chinese perspective, how should the world be organized and look like? So this is, however, not only something which is happening in China. So it's a reciprocal process. And you have on the one hand, China is making itself as a great power, and on the other hand, you have also the narrating that Eurasia is becoming a political entity, or at least an arena where a world political order-making process is happening, and that's informing each other. That's not a one-way discourse. And of course, there's a contradiction always, and that's Audrey's wonderful presentation brought that out. How can you be open to the world, and the Belt and Road is about opening to the world, and at the same time enforce and keep your own system, and even make it more stringent or more strict, and that's what's happening. So there's an internal contradiction. It's really difficult to get out of this contradiction. Yeah, and that's a part of that is very interesting thing. Like when in the United States before the Second World War, there was practically no knowledge about the rest of the world. Only with the start of the Cold War, where area starts developing, and that's happening in China now as well. So that's quite interesting part of the story. And let me just switch on to, maybe there's a couple of things we can have in the discussion, two last thoughts. One is, how is the Belt and Road sustainable? Right? Is it really sustainable? And one argument is there's an overstretch, and that's actually something which is discussed in China much more than outside of China. Is there enough soft power? There are other competing projects. Right? India has started its own project. There's the Quad is coming in, and so forth. A couple of other strategic challenges to that project. But there's also frictions with Russia. The Eurasian Economic Union, I cannot be talking about that, and the Belt and Road are, to a certain extent, actually contradictory and even mutually exclusive. But there's a lot of frictions which are not visible from the official rhetoric. And then simply the question which many Chinese raise, is this not too big an ambition? Can we sustain that diplomatically, financially, and so forth? Can we really bring that up? And last but not least, from a country point of view, the country participating, many of these countries already in a debt trap. So this is just growing, and in the end this will also go back to China, right? Because after all, they are then the ones responsible because they handed out the money. And they have to deal with those debts of those countries. Okay, I end here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We had some two very, please come forward again. We had some two very interesting and enlightening discussions. I would say we had the view from Washington and the view from Shanghai. And let me ask a question both to the view from Washington and to the view from Shanghai. Here in Chapel Hill, when we look at what is going on in the White House in DC, with respect, it looks a little bit like chaos and incoherence. But you tell us that the Trump administration actually has a well-thought-out strategy towards how to deal with China. Is that really correct? Is there such a thoughtful, well-deliberated strategy, or is it just impulsiveness?
Well, I think it's kind of step by step, right? You can't actually predict the future in a trade situation like this, because you're always waiting for the other guy to blink a little bit. So if you're going to raise the stakes somehow, you have to then see, and it's like any other negotiation, what the other guy's reaction is going to be. So if you're negotiating a contract, or I don't know, getting a divorce, or doing something with another party, you might have in your head like a basic strategy, but you're not necessarily going to know what the end game is. And I would say also the Trump administration has announced a national security strategy where it has a lot of trade and economic components. So one thing that I can say is economic security and national security have been much more linked in this administration than, for example, in the Obama administration, where you could be in the White House situation room, those rooms you hear about in the basement, they really exist. The one next door is talking about the South China Sea, and the one I'm in is talking about economic policy, and they're completely separate conversations. Whereas now I feel that the conversations are more joined. So that is an articulation of a policy, and it's very different from the Obama administration's policy. But I can't say that we know, or even I might not know it because I'm too low level, but those who are running it, they may not know where it's going to end, but they have an idea in mind that they've had in their minds for a very long time about how to change the dynamics with China, how to stir the pot.
Thank you. But initially we were told, or we could read, that because of North Korea, Trump was being very friendly and cooperative with towards China. Think of the Florida summit, which you mentioned. There was harmony, a new harmony. And that is now gone, or North Korea has been, or cooperation with China and North Korea has been forgotten about. Now we focus on the trade war?
No, I think we're seeing Trump talking about going to North Korea. North Korea was just in China. I think we're seeing different dimensions happening in a different order than they've ever happened in the past. And I think it's intentional on this administration's part to, again, stir the pot differently, because they want things to change more rapidly. They're not looking for a long-term, kind of thing where it takes for a beyond the administration's term. I think they really want to see change in their time frame.
So is it possible to cooperate with China on North Korea, but have, let's say, tense economic and trade relations?
That's what Trump himself says. He said, you're my best friend. I'm going to do these bad things because it's not fair what's going on. But on the other hand, I respect you. You lead your country well. I have great regard for you as a man and as a friend. And I think we can do both at the same time and end up in a place where we actually are cooperating. But we have to go through this kind of dark tunnel before we get to the other end of it. And he said that on Twitter, I don't know, this weekend or something.
Right. And if he says it on Twitter, it must be true, obviously. Yeah, clearly.
He must mean it.
Yeah, right. What is the view from Shanghai? Is China prepared to cooperate on North Korea, but be, let's say, treated harshly from their point of view in economics terms?
I think China has no choice, they have to cooperate, but they play a longer game. So I think that their orientation time-wise is much longer. Because the key for China strategically is to keep North Korea stable, for prohibiting a migration crisis and a refugee crisis in northern China. That's one, and strategically speaking, North Korea is a buffer, and there's certainly a very high interest that there will never be American troops north of the 38 line. So that's a key imperative from the Chinese point of view, and actually the Chinese were really caught off guard with what happened with that proposed summit. We don't have a date yet, right? So maybe it's never going to happen. We don't know that. But certainly the Chinese felt, or Chinese government felt, that the game is suddenly out of their hands totally. And I think they are also to blame themselves for that, because they made some diplomatic efforts, but they also let it down a long time ago. After the six-party talks had no results, there was no other initiative from the Chinese side. So they gave that game to somebody else, and Trump took it up. But maybe back to your original question, I think initially the Chinese government has thought we rather prefer Trump as a president than Hillary Clinton, because it was clear that Hillary Clinton would be much harsher on China than Trump will possibly be. And also they thought maybe Trump is easier to be manipulated. It turned out not so. It turned out so that actually the Chinese side is really scared because they absolutely don't know what's happening. And if that is creating chaos or steering the pot, if that's really a strategy, I'm not sure about that, but if it's really a strategy, it worked well. And because it pushed a lot of things in a way that the Chinese government has no way to respond, and no answer to that one. And the question is, does this in the end lead to constructive negotiations and to solutions in the trade issue, in the North Korea question, but also in the Taiwan question? We should not forget Taiwan is a major conflict, and it's not unlikely that in the next 1 or 2 years the Chinese side will try forcefully to reunite Taiwan with the mainland. That's a huge discussion now in Beijing, that now is the window to do that. There were also considerations that there might be a deal. You take out North Korea, we get back Taiwan. It seems to be that has been ruled out on the Chinese side. But there is larger things going on with regards to the regional order. So that's not just an isolated conflict, what we see, like South China Sea, Taiwan and North Korea. That's connected areas of a larger political bargain.
Thank you. Final question. You tried to explain that a lot of the policy of China, of the economic policy, the foreign policy, is actually domestically driven. While we in the West may see it as expansionist or geopolitically trying to obtain an influence. If that is so, the Chinese must realize that. So why is their propaganda not emphasizing that, telling us what really drives their policy, so to prevent that wrong impression being obtained abroad?
Well, it's very difficult for the Chinese side to prevent any anti-Chinese discourse. Why? Because there's such a strong inclination to see whatever China does as a threat. And this China threat theory comes back, is very strong. So whatever the Chinese do, it will be always very hard for them to assure or have some reassurances that it's not about global hegemony. As an analyst, I have to say, for me that's laughable, because China has one small military outpost in Djibouti. That's all what they have. They have no hard power whatsoever which reach beyond their own coasts. And with one aircraft carrier, which hardly can operate at the moment, that's really not a big sort of hard power. There is something going on at a strategic level, but in terms of projection power, what China has vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis the United States, that's totally a different game. So all of this narrative that China is close to regional hegemony or even global hegemony, it's just nonsense. There is no data for that. That's not happening, right? Just think about the United States. How many bases does the United States have worldwide? How many? More than 1,000 bases. China has one. So how can you speak about China being a global hard power? That's not there. There's no evidence. So we have a discourse, a very strong discourse, that China might become a threat and China has hegemonic ambitions. And some have hegemonic ambitions, of course. But they know themselves. They're far away from realizing that. Right? What they do is basically trying to change a little bit the regional order. A little bit. But there's not much change there.
Thanks a lot. So a bit China-like is a bit like the EU, really, with much military power. Thanks very much. Let's open it up to questions from you. What you say? Can I, the gentleman here in the second row? Yeah.
Thank you, Klaus, and thank you both for coming here. You said a lot of things tonight that resonate very directly with a book I happened to pick up about a year ago. And I'm wondering what your opinion is. I think you know Michael Pillsbury, most likely, and his book, The 100-Year Marathon, China's Secret Strategy to Replace America as the Global Superpower. What are your thoughts in light of this? You said China takes a long-term view. They do. You basically mocked what Michael Pillsbury had said, what your last statement was, China will never become the global power. But where do you see Michael's book and his thinking fitting into the global strategy for the long term?
I said that at the moment it's far from that. I'm not saying that in 100 years down the road it's possible. But if you look at the demographic, economic data, and if you look at especially economics, China maybe has a 10-year time frame. After 10 years, the economy of China will go down. It still will be a very important economy because it's just so large. But how innovative can it really be? I have really doubts. There will be some technological breakthroughs because there's so many money spent on AI and other stuff. But is that enough to drive the entire economy? The serious debate is the so-called middle income trap. And that's pretty much the reality of the Chinese economy. If you cannot go beyond that, you don't have the financial and economic resources, also not the ideas, by the way, to become a true global hegemon. So I don't believe there will be a Chinese hegemony. We will have much more a multipolar world. And China will be one of the strong poles, yes, but not a global hegemon.
What do you make of that?
I think I agree. It's not really my exact field, but it was Chinese officials always talk to us about the middle income trap and their fears around that. And I think this indigenous innovation movement against which the Trump administration is now acting specifically it worries China because the very thing that they need the most, we're trying to keep it from them.
Thank you. Yeah.
Do you consider the newly created longest sea bridge ever constructed in China, the Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau Bridge, to be part of the Belt Road Initiative or just a domestic policy? Can you elaborate on how that's going to change things with international relations?
I've been reading today that some of the islands built for that bridge are sort of going away. I don't know, but I've been listening to Vietnamese experts who said that the Chinese islands built up in the South China Sea will have the same fate. It didn't have. It stayed. That's all now labeled in China, maybe as part of the Belt and Road because it's sort of in the southern hub. But this is a strategy of local governments to attract funding and to be part of the national narrative. Whether it's really Belt and Road, I think it's unrelevant, not important.
Thank you. Yes, there, please.
Rather than projecting force by military power, isn't China going to achieve hegemony by basically buying natural resources around the globe, buying up ports? In effect, they have bases in South America and Africa. They're just civilian bases.
Audrey, what about
then we have a debate about a definition, what is bases and how can they be used and for what purposes. That's why I pointed out this economic reality of China becoming a global economic player. Of course, you have interests everywhere. And one of the issues which is more concerning, I think, for the Chinese point of view, is the fact that if you operate in countries like Somalia or like Sudan or like Pakistan, you are inevitably part of the security situation there. So you have to be, you are affected, you have much higher risk, you have maybe to provide security, and that's an issue, right? How you do that. Because the Chinese have been actually very restrained in using the People's Liberation Army or Navy to do that, but in the future that might happen, right? There was this rescue mission in Yemen and in Libya, where once they couldn't do it, but the second time they did it, and it was a huge, in Chinese public that was discussed a lot, because the Chinese state was able to provide that security, but that's on a totally different level, right? We are talking here about workers and Chinese citizens, which need to be safe in that way, and that's an issue. Whether you have a couple of ports, whether you control an element of the global logistics system, which is, by the way, much more controlled from Denmark because they own a lot of logistic companies. I don't buy in that narrative. I don't see that. Has China enough idea power, soft power, to turn around the global order? Far from. Far from.
Thank you. Yes.
Well, thank you for two fascinating talks. I was glad to hear from Ms. Winter that the administration has filed a WTO case. And I'm curious about previous cases. How many cases in the past, since 2001, have been filed against China, and how successful have they been?
Well, thank you. I'm glad you're happy that we filed a WTO case. I can think of a few that we should still file. I don't, I'm not good with remembering numbers. I'm going to say there's been 20 cases against China where the United States has been the plaintiff, but I'm just guessing. Like it's roughly that since China joined the WTO. One thing about the WTO is these agreements are very specific, right? They don't deal with everything. And so you can't, one time I remember somebody saying, well, that's anti-competitive. And we were in a meeting on the Hill, and I stood up and said, and people were complaining, why doesn't Ambassador, at the time it was Susan Schwab, bring more WTO cases? And I stood up and I said, well, what we're discussing here isn't covered by the WTO. So why are we discussing something and people are worried that we're not bringing WTO cases? We should be talking about new rules in the WTO. New rules that our agreements need to have to prevent non-tariff barriers from being used by countries, including our own, right, in international trade and investment contexts. And there's not a lot of support, even in the United States, for having better international rules. That's the very thing we just got through voting against, right? Let's just close the doors and kind of be a little bit more domestic and keep what we have and maybe negotiate a few new things, but more or less keep America the way it is. And so if we don't have rules to get to address a lot of the things that governments do, then you can't complain when USTR doesn't bring more WTO cases, because you have to be able to sue on the basis of something that you can put on a piece of paper that exists and you can take it to a WTO panel. As far as our success rate, it's been very, very good. I mean, we basically bring cases that we know we're going to win. So sometimes we bring the easy cases because we know we're going to win. Sometimes we don't bring the hard cases because we're afraid we'll get sued too, right? Because we're not perfect. And so I think there's a shift now towards a greater interest in the harder cases because, first of all, the easy cases have been brought and mostly won. I can think of one where it was a draw and we didn't really win against China, but we didn't really lose. I think we're going to have to look deep within these agreements and even this case we brought on licensing. It's not a slam dunk, in my opinion. I mean, it's a hard case to win, and it's going to be a tough fight, and it takes forever. And then you end up with, and this is part of the narrative now, the United States has serious concerns about how the WTO is functioning anyway, institutionally, in terms of some of the decision-making coming out of Geneva and how it's been kind of reading too much into these agreements. So Geneva isn't a court of general jurisdiction like U.S. federal courts. The judges are supposed to, or the panel and the appellate body, they're supposed to decide the discrete legal issue on their table and nothing else. And sometimes they take forever, like in the Airbus, Boeing, or whatever you want to call it, the aircraft cases that have been going on for more than a decade. That could have been my case, and I got rid of it. I knew it would be my entire career. And that was a smart decision. But, there's a case, part of that whole movie is now before the appellate body, and it's been years that the appellate body's been thinking about this. They're supposed to, they shall decide in 90 days. But they don't. They ride and think and ride, and that's not what Geneva was intended to be. So one of the things that the United States is doing right now is shaking up a lot of the institutional dust in Geneva and trying to explain that to Germany and the EU and other trading partners why we're doing this. Because we need quicker decisions that are more emphatic and that don't try to read too much into these agreements that the members didn't agree to. So that was a long-winded answer, but I hope I've given you some additional information.
Thank you. There was great alarm about the economic practices of Japan in the 1980s. Have lessons been learned, or the lessons are applicable, or is it totally something different?
Well, back then we didn't have binding dispute settlement. Right now with the Uruguay round in the mid-1990s, you can go to the panel, and if you win and the other country doesn't change whatever bad thing it was doing, you can ask the panel to let you retaliate against that country. And back then, you won and then you kind of worked it out.
Yeah.
So I think, in a way, it is a little bit back to the future because this administration hopes that by using the Japan-style tariff methodology, that China will come to the table and work it out. And kind of the WTO won't be as much a part of the movie as it has been between us and trading partners since binding dispute settlement took effect in 1995.
All right, thanks. This gentleman here.
I have a domestic question to ask you. Our president is considered a great negotiator. This potential trade war is impacting on our financial markets and also our agricultural markets in the Midwest. Do you think Congress is going to support Mr. Trump if he takes a hard line on it?
I mean, so far, Congress has given the president some flexibility, right? And I think the United States Trade Representative right now does have a certain degree. He comes from the Hill, right? He used to work on the Hill. He used to work at USTR. Most people on both sides of the aisle like him, like what he says. You know, I think if the markets were to react terribly badly for a long period of time, people would rethink. I mean, or would think that would be a factor, right? But the hope is that China will blink, and if not, we're going to have to figure out how much pain we can take. But they buy more from, we buy more from them than they buy from us. I mean, the intention here is to hurt the U.S. economy as little as possible.
So it's like a cowboy film. Who blinks first?
For how long?
Yeah, indeed. Thank you. Yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you both for coming. There are several things I wanted to ask, but I'll try and keep it brief. Our withdrawal from the TPP, what impact is that going to have on our ability to function in that part of the world? And then the fact that Trump is acting against individual countries rather than going through the WTO seems to indicate that, well, he's abandoning the process, and that seems to be creating a threat to its ability to continue to function or survive. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. So, you can see both of your, questions from both sides, right? And I think you do, and I think that's important as well. TPP, we have agreements with many of the important countries in that grouping. In South Korea, Singapore, Canada, Mexico. I don't know whoever else, but it's an area where I think first and foremost that was kind of our anchor in the Pacific from a hegemonic standpoint, as well as from a commercial standpoint. So it's hard to imagine that ultimately Japan won't do a deal with us bilaterally because they just did one with the EU. We're going to go to them and say, you're going to do one with the EU but not with us, that's not okay. Right, so I think we'll be able to end up in a place in the Pacific that's something like what TPP would have factually given us. We just won't have the name brand TPP thing. And I think there have been a couple of statements, very lighthearted, that Trump made in Davos and in other places where he's not like totally against TPP, but it would have to have different other attributes. And I can pick up from everything I see that these kind of rules of origin, how much content has to be in a product. And I think he really wants to see a lot more American content in a product if it's going to benefit from the agreement we're talking about. So that's kind of the NAFTA situation, right? He wants to see more American content and less, German auto companies going to Mexico. He'd rather see them all in South Carolina or North Carolina, right? So that's something that I think is important to this administration is to, like any administration, if you have, like China, if you have market power because you're big, you want your friends to play by, rules that don't drive investment elsewhere from your friends.
By the rules you set.
You know, it's just an obvious thing to try to do.
I just find it very ironic that a German auto manufacturer comes to the U.S. to make his cars and sells them, ships them off to sell in China.
Well, right, but a lot of German auto companies make their stuff outside Germany, in Europe, because it's so expensive. They've already played that game and been able to survive, so they figure what's wrong with serving both the U.S. market and other markets out of South Carolina. You know, so that's kind of, I think, where German auto companies are. It's a hedge as well as, you know, a lot of other things, but they're kind of used to it.
But the best ones are still being made in Germany, of course.
I have one. I vouch for it.
Yes, please.
China's investing a lot of money in countries that are less than stable. What would Beijing's reaction be if all these countries down the road come and say we can't repay our debt?
I didn't hear that. Can you repeat that for a second?
Since China's investing money in countries that are not quite stable, if these countries come to China and say we cannot repay our debt, what will their reaction be?
If they default.
Yeah, but that's already happening. You have Venezuela, you have Pakistan, which is now hoping to be bailed out by Saudi Arabia and China together. You have Sri Lanka, where this is the case. So this is already happening, and the Chinese government has shown that it finds its way out there. So that's not ending up in a disaster for that country. However, in the case of Sri Lanka, for example, there was a renegotiation of a huge airport and port facility in the south of the country, and it ended up with, because Sri Lanka couldn't pay up some of its loans, that the Chinese side got a 99-year leasing right on that territory, including all of the businesses related to it. And according to the officials I spoke to in Sri Lanka, nobody blames China. That's really interesting. Nobody. Why? Because China has helped Sri Lanka so much in the last 15 years in a quite difficult situation during the civil war, where nobody else would help them. So they have a lot of goodwill. And the point is, with all these investments, if those countries who are receiving the investments are not building up very strong domestic capabilities to run those infrastructures, to maintain them, to develop business models around them, both public, private, and private, they can't make something out of the investment. So in the end, the taxpayer has to take it, but there is no real economic development coming from that. You can blame this on China, but you have to blame this even more so on the governments who are not capable of doing so.
Thank you. We've got time for one or two questions. Yeah, here.
So I've read recently that China is in the process of implementing a social credit system where they extend or withhold privileges to citizens based on their demonstrated loyalty to the government. How is this going to affect entrepreneurial activity and innovation in China? And could this possibly be a means for the government to control U.S. firms given the joint venture mandate in China now?
Thank you.
That's a very interesting question, and actually a German think tank called the Merix Institute wrote a paper on that about 6 months ago. It was kind of stealth for a while, not everybody was focused on it. We're already seeing, it's not really, I think, under the social credit system, and you're absolutely right in the way you describe it, in my opinion, but where the Chinese government and party are encouraging Western companies to have Communist Party cells in their companies. So like, for example, I remember going to the firm MAYER, which is, I think, not state-owned, but kind of all companies in China have to kind of be government affiliated in some way. Anyway, I just was in the elevator and I said to my boss, hey, let's press 8 for the Communist Party floor. You know, I was just kidding, right? But there actually was an 8, and I have to confess I was surprised to see it, because I'd never actually seen it with my own eyes, that this is, you know, you can't imagine going to IBM and pressing 8 for the U.S. government floor. So it just struck me as very strange, and so I think our European colleagues have noted this to us recently, that they're also very concerned about the Chinese government party cells and this kind of stressing to Western companies that they have to toe the Xi Jinping line through hopefully setting up things like this. And I think it's just in the developmental phase, but in a very lighthearted way that would be hard to enforce. China's WTO obligations do say that there should not be, I don't know what the exact words are, but intervention or interference in the investment decisions of foreign companies going into China. So I think, one could look at that as some indication that these kind of interferences in Western company, through either the social credit system, which is kind of this loyalty program, or through some other means, is something that would raise a lot of concerns in Washington, and kind of already is, as in terms of what if we were having ongoing dialogue with China, like really like we were in the Obama administration. I think it's a foregone conclusion that we would be openly talking about that at my level and saying, why are you doing this?
Thank you. One final question, perhaps? Yes, Mike. A brief one, please.
I haven't formulated my question clearly, but just one point. In a non-physical confrontation between nation states, they usually aim at the center of gravity, both in China and the US. As far as China is concerned, it's authoritarian, and the balance of trade between the US and China. China has a weak hand. I don't think they could handle the second round of sanctions. However, their first response, targeting the Midwest with agriculture and meat products, has a political aspect of it, which has not been recognized. And this is where our president derives his power, from the House and Senate. The House is in balance, the Senate may be affected. We're not talking 100-year confrontation, we're talking 100 days. And I don't think anyone can be sure as to who is going to blink first.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that the political consequences of these decisions have to be assessed, and I hope that the people that make those calculations are thinking about it, related to the other gentleman's question as well. What I can say is that, in listening to our senior staff, meaning, people that are there confirmed by the Senate, and interfacing with the agricultural community in Washington in the face of this now tariff list by China, the general reaction has been, we're generally with you. I mean, we have some ability to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. I mean, it wasn't like, glowing support, but it was nevertheless an understanding, and you could see this coming a mile away, that China was going to react on ag. And by the way, none of these tariffs are in effect yet, so let's be very clear about that. Ours has a notice and comment period, and China just said, we'll decide what we're going to do once the U.S. acts.
Just one comment, you're absolutely correct. None of the sanctions are affected, but the damage is being done right now.
Fair enough.
That is the problem.
Before we close for tonight, I would like to remind you that scholars are always very good in predicting the future, as you know. And I would like to ask our two experts here now to risk their career by doing so. So what will be the future of American-Chinese relations, let's say, within the next year or so? Audrey.
I'm not good at this.
Will it be resolved, or will there be serious conflict? At whatever level?
I think it's too early. We haven't even gotten off the ground yet. So it's pretty hard to say if in a year this is resolved. I think it will be hard for China to change its industrial policies to the satisfaction of the United States. And the question is, are other countries going to be pushing China as well to change? And will we see any real change by China? I mean, I think we will see real change by China, and I hope.
Will it be sufficient?
I don't know. I don't have a good answer to your question.
That's a shame. Thank you.
Should I say all of this is off the record, of course. This one as well. I would make this a bit broader. I think, I mean, the so-called trade war, and by the way, gentlemen, I would say, yes, we have a lot of considerations for the people who might be negatively affected, but if we talk trade war, war means suffering. Somebody will suffer. So if we don't have the guts to do the war, we should just not think even about, right? And if you really conduct a war, then maybe some people have to suffer a long time, or some industries, or some affected groups. That's just a reality. I'm not arguing for it, but I'm just saying, I mean, with the point that some people will suffer in the future, to say that's not an issue, that's not convincing for me. On the Chinese side also, many people will suffer, by the way, and many industries will suffer. Maybe the whole manufacturing industry will go down, a lot of restructuring, half of them going out to Bangladesh, Vietnam, and so forth. So there might be potentially massive impacts on the Chinese side. Right? That's the other side. Okay, but so I would make this broader. I mean, one thing is the trade conflict, the other thing is the North Korea conflict, the other thing is South China Sea. That's much bigger game. We're talking here about a potential nuclear war. Don't forget, the president of this country has threatened to use nuclear weapons if it's needed against North Korea. We shouldn't forget that. So from my point of view, I mean, I'm an art scholar, this is more important than the trade war, most definitely, because that's about survival. The trade war, some people will suffer, yes, but that's not a fundamental, essential, possibility that there might be a nuclear war in East Asia. And from that point of view, I think this year will be more escalation, most definitely, in all these areas. I don't see what can be the outcome from the North Korean summit, if there's one. If there's no outcome, it's even more dangerous, because then something has to happen. What is that something? So that's for me the biggest question in the equation. And therefore I would say this year will be an extremely dangerous and very escalatory way.
On this cheerful note, let me thank our two experts, Audrey Winter and Maximilian. Thank you very much for coming tonight. We hopefully will see you again next semester when we are up and running again. Have a nice summer, and please don't forget about us by looking at our YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.